Hello and welcome, I'm Gina Shakespeare. On this episode of Declassified, a researcher has reported that Soviets created child trafficking rings in the West for blackmail, rings that are believed to still be operating. This story gives a background account of an alleged Soviet operation to use children for honeypots in order to lure foreign governments into committing serious crimes so they can be blackmailed. We believe the account is credible enough to warrant telling and include additional research to support it. A scholar on Soviet Russia has uncovered claims that former General Secretary Yuri Andropov wanted to subvert the West by creating child trafficking and pedophile networks to blackmail business leaders and politicians. Details on the program were uncovered by Jeffrey Nyquist in his research on communist regimes and their influence on the West. His main source is the grandson of a former member of the Soviet Central Committee, who opposed the program and was possibly killed because of his opposition. Two other sources of his were defectors from the Soviet Union who revealed information on Soviet experiments on pedophilia and sexual perversion. His contact, who is currently living in the West, said his grandfather was part of a faction within the Central Committee that opposed the program. Yet the dissenters, including his grandfather, were believed to have been killed for their opposition, and the program was able to move forward. Nyquist said, quote, "The grandfather told his family, Andropov is building networks for child trafficking and pedophilia, and this is a program the KGB has begun internationally around the world," unquote. The purpose of the program was to seduce politicians and business leaders, then control them as agents through blackmail. Two other eyewitness sources of Nyquist's say the Soviet Union began conducting experiments in its Komsomol camps on how to grow sexual perversions. The camps were for members of the Communist Young Pioneers and included children aged 10 to 15. According to Nyquist, the Soviets were organizing orgies in some of the camps and said, quote, "They were trying to locate perverts to recruit them," unquote. Nyquist also said, quote, "The idea was that in these Komsomol camps they were looking for people who had psychological problems that caused them to become sexually perverse in different ways. It was like they were studying different perversions and the causes and how to cultivate that, how to extend it, what kinds of things draw people toward blacker perversions," unquote. If the KGB honey traps somebody, they don't know who they're working for because a KGB officer may be somebody who speaks English without an accent who merely references themselves as part of an organized crime group, unquote. Accounts by child victims and police reports reveal shocking claims of sexual abuse, dark occult practices, and the involvement of high-level officials. After a person has been compromised in the honey trap, the agents or the front organization can continue offering services to the target in exchange for work while maintaining evidence to blackmail the targets if they have qualms about cooperating. This tactic is still widely used, including by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The CCP was accused in 2015 of using attractive women to seduce spies from the British intelligence agency and lure them into honey traps to obtain state secrets. A top MI6 memo obtained by the UK's Mirror news outlet said the Chinese spies were aggressively targeting spies and their families. Honey traps were also very common under the Soviet Union. Former KGB General Oleg Kalugin explained it once, stating, according to Foreign Policy, that, quote, "In America, in the West, occasionally you ask your young men to stand up for their country. There's very little difference. In Russia, we ask our young women to lay down," end quote. The timing of the Soviet child trafficking program corresponds with a sudden uptick of pedophile rings uncovered in the West. While it's likely similar forms of abuse had existed previously, the new scandals aligned closely with what Nyquist's source warned of. In the 1980s and into the 90s, shocking cases of pedophilia and extreme abuse began to emerge in the United States, Australia, and Europe. Many of the cases involved high-level officials. Some were prosecuted, but many were thrown out due to lack of physical evidence and child testimony not being recognised. Among the most prominent cases was that of billionaire Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted pedophile accused of holding underage girls as sex slaves on his private Caribbean island. He flew numerous top politicians and business leaders to the island on his private plane, dubbed by news outlets as the Lolita Express. According to press reports, the plane has a bed that was used for sex with young girls. According to the same reports, flight logs from Epstein's plane show that former President Bill Clinton flew on the Lolita Express 26 times. Epstein was very well connected. It had been reported that he kept contact numbers of figures including Tony Blair, Naomi Campbell, Dustin Hoffman, Michael Bloomberg and Richard Branson, but no flight logs have ever surfaced showing any of them ever flew to Epstein's island. Often overlooked in Epstein's case is that the father of his ex-girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell was deceased media tycoon Robert Maxwell, who Ghislaine accused of sexually abusing her. Robert Maxwell may also have been a Soviet spy. According to FBI files released in 2013, Maxwell, who was born in Czechoslovakia and was living in the United Kingdom, was believed to be using his Pergamon press media empire in the 1950s to provide intelligence to the Soviet Union. The heavily redacted reports noted that when Maxwell and his business partner Kurt Wallensteiner were running their Anglo-Continental exchange firm in London in 1953, both had, quote, allegedly been recruited by the Soviet intelligence service for espionage purposes, end quote. Former FBI agent Mark Ruskin said in a previous interview that two agents from the Belgian National Police told him of a child abuse ring in Belgium in the mid-1990s that also allegedly involved government officials. Ruskin said, quote, they had been working on the case that involved political corruption, and also there was a child pornography aspect to it as well. And as their investigation proceeded, they began to develop subjects, targets of the investigation, who were high-level public officials, unquote. As their investigations grew deeper, however, the agents were called into their supervisor's office and told to drop the case. Ruskin said, referring to political corruption of law enforcement, that, quote, this was Western Europe, not some underdeveloped country with a dictator. If it can happen in Western Europe, it can happen anywhere, unquote. What Ruskin reported happened in Belgium, shocking claims of a pedophile ring servicing high-level officials whose investigation was hushed up, has happened elsewhere in the West. Starting in 1980, victims of pedophile networks that fit the picture outlined by the Soviets began to step forward in the West, but a new element began to be commonly reported. Accounts by child victims and police reports reveal shocking claims of sexual abuse, dark occult practices, and the involvement of high-level officials. This began the so-called Satanic Panic, which lasted into the mid-90s. It resulted in prison sentences for only a handful of perpetrators and also led to multiple claims of government-level conspiracies behind the rings. Among the most famous cases was the Franklin child prostitution ring case from 1988 to 1990. The case in Omaha, Nebraska alleged that high-level politicians were involved in a child prostitution ring where children were flown to private parties of politicians where they were abused. Victims alleged other crimes including cannibalism, human sacrifice, and drug trafficking. The defendants were eventually found not guilty, but the way the case played out was criticized as a cover-up. The three main witnesses were instead charged with perjury, and many key figures in the case would later turn up dead. Documented problems with the case were later compiled by former state senator John DeCamp in his book The Franklin Cover-Up, Child Abuse, Satanism and Murder in Nebraska, where he states, quote, 2 grand juries, one local and one federal, had a mandate to consider these and other charges of child abuse connected with the Franklin Credit Union. They indicted the victim witnesses for perjury instead. End quote. DeCamp also states that evidence in the case, quote, leads into drug trafficking, money laundering, pornography, child prostitution, and the kidnapping and sale of children in different parts of the United States and abroad. End quote. Award-winning author and filmmaker Tim Tate produced a documentary on the Omaha case, uncovering many similar findings. The Discovery Channel was set to broadcast the documentary Conspiracy of Silence in May 1994, yet abruptly cancelled it before it could air. Tate explains on his website the sensitivity with covering the topic of satanic ritual abuse, noting that in his experience, quote, touch it and, professionally at least, you die, end quote. The full documentary, which was in the late stages of editing, was later published online. In a case in the United Kingdom, former British Member of Parliament Jeffrey Nyquist, who died in 1995, investigated what he said, according to the Washington Post, was a pedophile ring of powerful individuals with big names. Barry Nyquist, the son of Jeffrey Nyquist, told the BBC that, quote, "My father thought that the dossier at the time was the most powerful thing that had ever been produced, with the names that were involved and the power that they had," unquote. His son provided the research to British authorities, but files went missing in 2014 around evidence of break-ins. An additional 114 documents on the alleged pedophile ring also went missing around the same time. The Guardian reported, quote, "The revelation that further relevant documents have disappeared will raise fresh fears of an establishment cover-up," end quote. Nyquist said his sources did not mention the element of satanic abuse in the alleged Soviet-backed pedophile rings, but he noted that as someone who has studied communist methods of infiltration and subversion, it doesn't seem unusual. Nyquist said, quote, "When the communists design an attack, they use such horrible methods. One of the advantages of a horrible method is that nobody believes that anyone would do such a thing," he said, end quote. The elements of forcing victims to commit ritual murder and killing anyone who refused to participate would also work as a control mechanism over anyone involved, since they would all be guilty, he said. He said the overall system, if true, would have given the Soviets and later post-Soviet participants significant power in establishing networks of influence and control. Nyquist said, quote, "Pedophilia, if you look at it, is an important tool for corrupting, controlling and manipulating a foreign government and sabotaging its economy, sabotaging its political process, even sowing confusion. This whole thing can be used in all kinds of creative ways to hurt the target country," unquote. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.